stretching from the icy peaks of the Himalayas down to the warm, humid shores of the Indian Ocean. This is a land where nearly every current of human civilization seems to have left its fingerprints. Home today to well over 1 billion people, modern India is a study in contradictions. It is simultaneously one of the oldest continuous cultures on the planet and one of the fastest-growing modern economies. It is a nuclear power that still reveres 2,000-year-old temples, a secular democracy built layer upon layer atop empires, sultanates, and colonial rule. Its languages number in the hundreds. Several of the world's major religions were either born here or found lasting refuge within its borders, and its recorded history stretches back further than almost any nation on Earth. But India was never built in a single sweep. It was shaped century after century by waves of migration and mysticism, by emperors and reformers, by foreign invaders and homegrown revolutionaries, and remarkably, each new arrival tended to be absorbed into the fabric of the subcontinent rather than simply wiped away. The story of how this ancient land became the nation it is today is a saga of faith, conquest, and constant reinvention. Consider the scale involved. Today's India is organized into dozens of states and union territories, recognizes more than 20 officially scheduled languages, and contains temples, mosques, and shrines whose foundations sometimes predate entire European nations. Few places on Earth ask a visitor, or a viewer, to hold quite so many centuries in mind at once. This is the history of India. Before we get into it, if you enjoy deep dives into the histories of great nations and civilizations, do consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. Long before there were kings, scriptures, or even a word for India, a remarkably advanced urban culture was already flourishing along the banks of a great river system in the northwest of the subcontinent. The Indus Valley civilization first took shape somewhere around 2600 BCE and endured for roughly 17 centuries, spreading across territory that today straddles the border between Pakistan and northwestern India. Archaeologists have identified more than 1,000 settlements belonging to this culture, but it's the major urban centers, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and Dholavira, that reveal just how sophisticated this civilization truly was. These were not haphazard clusters of huts. Entire cities were laid out in careful grid patterns, with streets crossing at right angles as if planned by committee. Ordinary homes came equipped with private wells and dedicated bathing rooms, and beneath the streets ran an underground drainage system that carried wastewater away from the city, a level of sanitation engineering that much of the ancient world simply hadn't imagined yet. Enormous granaries preserved surplus harvests against lean years, purpose-built dockyards supported river and coastal commerce, and large public bathing structures point towards some form of shared civic or ceremonial life. What's striking is the consistency. Brick sizes, weights, and measures appear nearly uniform across cities, separated by hundreds of miles, hinting at a centralized authority or governing council of some kind, even though we still have no idea who actually held power. Commerce was the lifeblood of this world. Merchants dealt in beads, carved ivory, and finely made pottery, and small stone seals stamped with animal figures suggest a system used for tracking trade, and quite possibly for religious or ceremonial purposes as well, though the script carved onto them has resisted every attempt at translation. Goods from these cities have turned up as far away as Mesopotamia, proof that the Indus world was plugged into a genuinely international exchange network thousands of years before anyone used that term. And then, almost as mysteriously as it appeared, the whole civilization began to unravel. By roughly 1900 BCE, the great cities were emptying out and falling into decline. Historians still argue over what exactly went wrong. Was it a dramatic shift in river courses that starved cities of water? A broader change in regional climate? Seismic activity reshaping the landscape? Or the gradual arrival of new populations reshaping the political order? Each theory has its defenders, and none has been conclusively proven. Deepening the mystery further, archaeologists have never uncovered a single grand palace, an identifiable royal tomb, or any solid evidence of a ruling monarchy, and the written script these people used simply disappeared along with the cities that had once given it purpose. Why any of this matters for the story ahead is worth pausing on. The instincts on display here, meticulous urban planning, a preference for trade over conquest, and a genuine taste for craftsmanship, would resurface again and again throughout Indian history, long after Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had crumbled into dust and silt. Cotton cultivation, likely domesticated somewhere within this world, would eventually clothe much of the ancient globe, and the sheer scale of the civilization, home to more people at its height than contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia, suggests the subcontinent was already capable of sustaining remarkably dense, organized societies. When the great cities finally emptied out, the people who had once filled them didn't simply vanish into thin air. They scattered into smaller settlements across the countryside, carrying fragments of that culture forward into whatever came next. As the old river cities faded into ruin, a new cultural force began moving into the subcontinent around 1500 BCE, the Indo-Aryans. Whether this unfolded as a slow, generations-long migration or something closer to an armed incursion remains one of the most contentious questions in South Asian history. Geneticists, linguists, and archaeologists have all weighed in over the decades, and the evidence still gets interpreted in strikingly different ways depending on who you ask. Whatever the mechanism, what these newcomers carried with them changed everything. The Sanskrit language, a rich oral tradition, and a growing body of sacred hymns that would eventually be compiled as the Vedas. The oldest of these, the Rig Veda, offers a window into a pastoral society organized around sacrificial ritual known as yajnas, and deep reverence for the forces of nature, fire honored as the god Agni, the sun personified as Surya, and the sky commanded by the mighty warrior deity Indra. These hymns would ultimately form the philosophical and religious bedrock of what we now know as Hinduism. During what's called the Vedic Age, spanning roughly 1500 to 600 BCE, society organized itself into four broad functional groups. Priestly Brahmins responsible for ritual and learning, warrior Kshatriyas who governed and fought, merchant and artisan Vaishyas who kept the economy running, and laboring Shudras who performed manual work. This fourfold division was originally described in Vedic literature as a functional arrangement of society, rather than a strictly hereditary one, at least in theory. Over the following centuries, this relatively fluid arrangement calcified into something far more rigid and hereditary: the caste system, or jati, an intricate social hierarchy that would go on to shape Indian life for thousands of years afterward. Toward the later Vedic period, small tribal chiefdoms began consolidating into full-fledged kingdoms known as Mahajanapadas, and religious ritual grew increasingly elaborate and formalized. At the same time, a new body of philosophical literature emerged, the Upanishads, which turned attention away from external ritual and inward toward contemplation, exploring ideas like karma, the moral order of dharma, and the ultimate goal of liberation, or moksha. These concepts became absolutely central to classical Hindu thought, which gradually broadened into a sprawling, remarkably inclusive system, absorbing local deities, embracing multiple valid paths to salvation, whether through devotion, knowledge, or right action, and accommodating a genuinely pluralistic view of the divine. That capacity to evolve continuously, while still staying tethered to its ancient Vedic roots, remains one of Hinduism's most defining and enduring qualities. Much of this ancient world can feel distant today, yet its fingerprints show up everywhere in modern Indian life. Sanskrit terms coined during this period still echo through everyday vocabulary, temple ritual, and classical music performance. The pantheon itself kept quietly shifting across the centuries. Deities once central to early Vedic hymnody, Indra chief among them, gradually receded in popular devotion, while others barely mentioned in the oldest texts, notably Shiva and Vishnu, rose to become the dominant focus of worship in the devotional religion that followed. That willingness to rewrite its own hierarchy of gods over time, rather than clinging rigidly to a fixed scripture, is arguably part of what allowed the tradition to keep adapting alongside a constantly changing society across thousands of years. By the 6th century BCE, the old Vedic order was starting to show serious cracks. Endless ritual sacrifice and an increasingly rigid caste hierarchy no longer satisfied a growing number of thinkers and seekers, and out of that restlessness, two profound spiritual movements took shape, both offering a direct challenge to establishment religion. Jainism, associated with the teacher Mahavira, who is believed to have lived roughly between 599 and 527 BCE, placed absolute non-violence, ahimsa, at the very heart of spiritual practice, paired with strict asceticism and rigorous self-discipline. Jain philosophy teaches that every living soul carries the potential for divinity within it, but that potential is weighed down by accumulated karma, which can only be shed through disciplined, truthful, non-harming conduct. Jain monks and nuns embraced extreme forms of austerity in pursuit of liberation, while lay followers lived by strict ethical codes and materially supported the monastic community around them. Crucially, Jainism openly rejected both the divine authority of the Vedas and the legitimacy of caste, insisting instead on personal responsibility, self-restraint, and inner purity as the true measures of a spiritual life. Around this same period, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama, born in territory that is now part of Nepal and living roughly between 563 and 483 BCE, walked away from a life of royal comfort in search of something deeper. After a long and intense period of meditation, he achieved enlightenment and became known to history as the Buddha. His teachings, most famously the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, offered followers a practical, step-by-step framework for ending suffering and achieving liberation. Buddhism's message of equality, simplicity, and disciplined monastic life resonated powerfully across every rung of the social ladder, and the faith received an enormous boost when Emperor Ashoka of the Maurya dynasty embraced it in the 3rd century BCE, dispatching missionaries who carried Buddhist teaching as far afield as Sri Lanka, China, Korea, and Japan. Jainism would go on to remain a resilient but geographically concentrated tradition, particularly strong in Western India. Buddhism, meanwhile, gradually receded within the subcontinent itself by around the 10th century CE, worn down by a resurgent, devotionally focused Hinduism and by the collapse of its own monastic institutions following later invasions, even as it went on flourishing magnificently across East and Southeast Asia. Though comparatively small in number within India today, both traditions left an outsized imprint on Indian ethics, art, and religious pluralism, and their shared emphasis on compassion, non-violence, and inward reflection still resonates well beyond the subcontinent's borders. Both faiths also reshaped the physical and intellectual landscape of the subcontinent in lasting ways. Buddhist stupas and monasteries sprang up along major trade routes, functioning simultaneously as rest stops for traveling merchants and centers of serious scholarship for resident monks, while Jain temples, frequently carved from gleaming white marble, became renowned for astonishingly intricate stonework that still draws visitors today. Pilgrimage networks tied these sacred sites together across enormous distances, letting religious ideas travel just as freely as trade goods did. And because both traditions flatly rejected the notion that spiritual worth was something inherited through birth into a particular caste, they offered a genuinely appealing alternative for communities who found themselves shut out of privilege under the older Vedic hierarchy. Around 321 BCE, an ambitious young leader named Chandragupta Maurya seized on the political chaos left in the wake of Alexander the Great's retreat from northwestern India. Moving quickly, he built the first empire to unify the majority of the Indian subcontinent under one political authority, backed by a genuinely sophisticated administrative apparatus and, by most accounts, an extensive network of spies and informants. A great deal of what we know about Mauryan statecraft comes down to us through the Arthashastra, a remarkably detailed treatise covering governance, economic policy, military strategy, and diplomacy, traditionally attributed to Chandragupta's chief advisor, Chanakya. The empire's treasury was filled through agriculture, brisk trade, and firm control over vital overland routes connecting Central Asia, the Middle East, and South Asia. The empire reached its true zenith under Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, who reigned from approximately 268 to 232 BCE, in what many historians regard as one of the genuine high points of Indian history. Ashoka began his rule as an aggressive and often brutal conqueror, and his campaign against the kingdom of Kalinga produced casualties on a horrifying scale. The sheer suffering he witnessed there is said to have profoundly shaken him. In its aftermath, he turned decisively toward Buddhism, embracing Dharma, a code of moral governance, alongside non-violence and genuine concern for public welfare. He then had these new principles carved directly onto stone pillars and rock faces scattered across the empire, inscribed in multiple regional languages and scripts, so that ordinary people, not just scholars, could actually read and understand them. These edicts promoted religious tolerance, ethical rule, and compassion toward all living beings, fusing personal spiritual conviction with hard practical statecraft, in a way rarely matched anywhere else in the ancient world. Ashoka's active patronage helped transform Buddhism from a regional Indian faith into a genuinely international religion. Ashoka's stone pillars, several of which still stand today, were crowned with finely carved capitals, the most celebrated depicting 4 lions standing back to back, an image so enduring that independent India would later adopt it as the national emblem, a small but telling sign of just how deeply this ancient ruler's legacy continues to resonate. Beneath the moral messaging carved into rock faces, the empire also ran on a remarkably granular bureaucracy, with officials overseeing everything from irrigation projects to market regulation, road maintenance to organized famine relief, giving Ashoka's subjects a level of coordinated governance that wouldn't be matched again in the region for a very long time. Following Ashoka's death, a string of weaker successors and mounting regional revolts caused the empire to gradually unravel. Even so, the Mauryan model, political unification, structured bureaucracy, and active cultural patronage set a template that virtually every subsequent Indian empire would draw on in one form or another. Several centuries of political fragmentation followed the Mauryan collapse, but out of that disorder eventually rose the Gupta Empire, founded by Chandragupta I. Frequently remembered as India's Golden Age, the Gupta period saw much of northern India consolidated under stable, confident rule, creating exactly the kind of conditions in which art, science, religion, and literature could flourish simultaneously. This was an era of genuinely extraordinary intellectual achievement. Indian mathematicians conceptualized 0 as a number in its own right and refined the decimal place value system, innovations that would eventually reshape mathematics on a global scale. The astronomer Aryabhata made striking advances in understanding the mechanics of the solar system, while the physician Sushruta pushed surgical technique well beyond anything most of the contemporary world had achieved. In literature, the poet and playwright Kalidasa emerged as the towering figure of classical Sanskrit writing. His play Shakuntala fused poetic elegance with genuine philosophical depth in a way that still captivates readers today. Meanwhile, the extraordinary rock-cut cave temples at Ajanta and Ellora showcased artistic mastery on a monumental scale, weaving Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain imagery together within the same sacred landscape. Religiously, the Gupta era stands out for its remarkable spirit of coexistence. Hinduism experienced a significant revival during this period, with devotion to Vishnu and Shiva spreading widely across the population, even as Buddhism and Jainism continued to hold genuine influence of their own. The Guptas actively supported all three traditions at once, a policy of pragmatic tolerance that allowed the era's cultural output to flourish largely undisturbed by sectarian conflict. That extended golden run came to an end in the middle of the 6th century CE, undone by repeated invasions from the Huna peoples and by mounting internal instability, which eventually splintered the empire into a patchwork of competing regional powers. Even so, the intellectual, scientific, and artistic legacy the Guptas left behind would go on shaping the subcontinent and eventually the wider world, long after the empire itself had disappeared from the map. Gupta-era trade networks stretched impressively far beyond India's own borders, with merchants and Buddhist pilgrims alike carrying goods, ideas, and religious texts along routes reaching Central Asia, China, and Southeast Asia. Sanskrit flourished as a courtly and scholarly language throughout this period, employed not only for poetry and drama, but for serious treatises on astronomy, medicine, and the art of governance. It's worth remembering that while parts of Europe were entering what's often labeled an early medieval decline, the Gupta court was quietly producing some of the era's most advanced mathematics and literature found anywhere on the planet. A useful reminder that intellectual progress has rarely followed one single, tidy global timeline. While dynasty after dynasty rose and fell across the north, the Deccan Plateau and the far south of the subcontinent were charting an entirely different course, producing powerful and culturally distinct kingdoms such as the Satavahanas, the Cholas, the Cheras, and the Pandyas. Ruling from roughly the 1st century BCE through the 3rd century CE, the Satavahanas controlled vast stretches of the Deccan and functioned as a cultural bridge between north and south, all while nurturing Indian Ocean trade routes that reached Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and even the East African coast. The Chola dynasty, dominant between the 9th and 13th centuries CE, pushed that maritime ambition to an entirely new level. Backed by a genuinely formidable navy, the Cholas projected Indian influence outward across Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and large parts of Southeast Asia, using their firm command of the sea lanes to spread trade, religion, art, and administrative practice well beyond the boundaries of the subcontinent itself. These southern kingdoms also left behind some of India's most breathtaking architecture. Long before the Cholas built their great stone temples, southern rulers were already funding irrigation tanks, canal networks, and agricultural infrastructure that turned the region into one of the subcontinent's most reliable food-producing zones. Wealth that in turn financed the temple-building boom that followed. The Brihadiswara temple at Thanjavur, completed in 1010 CE, stands as living proof of Chola engineering ambition. Its towering gateway spires, known as gopurams, and its densely carved stonework, still drawing admiration from visitors more than 1,000 years later. Far from being mere houses of worship, these temple complexes functioned as genuine economic engines, centers of formal education and hubs of everyday community life all at once. This period also gave birth to the Bhakti movement, an intensely personal wave of devotion directed toward gods like Shiva and Vishnu that deliberately pushed back against dry, priest-mediated ritualism. Poet-saints such as Appa, Sundarar, and the Alvars composed devotional hymns in regional languages rather than formal Sanskrit, spreading a message of spiritual equality that helped stitch together diverse linguistic and cultural communities under one shared devotional current. The cultural reach of these southern kingdoms extended well beyond their own political borders. Chola-sponsored temple architecture and administrative practice influenced court culture as far away as Cambodia and Indonesia, where echoes of Indian religious and artistic tradition still surface in monuments like Angkor. A rich Tamil literary tradition flourished alongside this expansion, producing an extensive body of poetry, philosophy, and formal grammar that remains a genuine source of regional pride today. Even now, the far south preserves a cultural continuity that in some ways feels less interrupted than the north, having been spared much of the disruption that later invasions brought to the Gangetic Plains. The early medieval centuries brought renewed political fragmentation, but, somewhat paradoxically, an even deeper current of cultural integration across regions. As centralized imperial power gave way to a patchwork of competing kingdoms, three in particular came to define the era: the Rashtrakutas in the Deccan, the Palas in Bengal and Bihar, and the Pratiharas further north. Ruling from roughly the 8th through 10th centuries CE, the Rashtrakutas became celebrated patrons of art and architecture, sponsoring the breathtaking rock-cut temple complexes at Ellora that remain, to this day, among India's greatest surviving Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain monuments. They also held firm control over major trade corridors, keeping cultural and commercial exchange flowing steadily through their territory. In the east, the Pala dynasty, active from the 8th to the 12th centuries CE, became strong champions of Buddhism, founding renowned centers of learning such as Nalanda and Vikramashila, institutions that drew scholars from across the whole of Asia to study and teach. This same period also saw tantric strands within both Buddhism and Hinduism come into wider prominence, introducing esoteric ritual practice and elaborate symbolic systems into mainstream religious life. Meanwhile, in the northwest, the Pratiharas played a genuinely critical defensive role, repeatedly repelling Arab incursions and helping preserve the subcontinent's cultural and religious continuity during an especially vulnerable stretch of its history. Spiritually, this was also the era in which the Bhakti movement gathered still further momentum, cutting decisively across barriers of both caste and gender through its emphasis on raw, personal, emotional devotion. At almost the same moment, Sufism, the mystical, inward-looking branch of Islam, built around themes of divine love and tolerance, began quietly taking root in northern India, laying groundwork for centuries of religious blending still to come. Despite the total absence of any single dominant political power, ideas, artistic forms, and religious movements continued circulating freely across this fractured landscape, ultimately setting the stage for the deeply pluralistic character that would go on to define medieval Indian civilization. This scattered political map also nurtured something else that still matters today: the deep regional identities that continue to define India's internal diversity. Distinct languages, artistic conventions, and culinary traditions solidified during these long centuries of fragmentation, as competing regional courts vied to outdo one another in patronage rather than simply imitating a single dominant center of imperial power. Guilds of merchants and craftsmen operated with genuine independence throughout this environment, financing temple construction and public infrastructure in ways that gave ordinary economic life an unusually prominent role in shaping the era's culture, even in the total absence of any single emperor calling the shots. In 1206 CE, following the fall of Delhi's last reigning Hindu king, an entirely new political order took root on the subcontinent, one governed by successive Islamic dynasties that would fundamentally reshape India's political, cultural, and religious landscape. The Delhi Sultanate passed through several ruling houses over the following centuries. First, the Mamluks, often referred to as the Slave Dynasty, then the Khaljis, followed by the Tughlaqs, and finally the Lodis, each contributing in turn to the expansion and consolidation of Muslim rule across the north. The Mamluks laid the essential groundwork, establishing Delhi as a fortified capital and securing the fertile plains of the Ganges. The Khalji dynasty, which held power from 1290 to 1320, pushed the Sultanate's reach deep into the Deccan through a series of aggressive military campaigns. The Tughlaqs, ruling from 1320 to 1414, attempted sweeping and often wildly ambitious administrative reforms, though these efforts were frequently undone by famine, rebellion, and sheer overreach. This whole period saw Persian firmly established as the language of the royal court, and elements of Islamic law began shaping governance more broadly, though individual rulers regularly adapted policy to fit India's stubbornly diverse religious makeup. Architecturally, an entirely new fusion style took shape, blending Islamic geometric design with indigenous craftsmanship to produce enduring landmarks like the towering Victory Tower, known as the Qutub Minar, and the ornately carved Alai Darwaza gateway, both still standing as showcases of genuine Indo-Islamic architectural achievement. Religious life during this period was anything but simple. While political authority sat firmly with Muslim sultans, the Hindu majority continued practicing its faith largely without interruption, and wandering Sufi mystics became crucial bridges between communities, their message of universal love cutting cleanly across sectarian lines. Around this same time, Bhakti poets like Kabir and Mirabai rose to real prominence among Hindu devotees, championing intensely personal devotion while openly challenging both caste discrimination and hollow ritual observance. Administratively, the Sultanate built out a genuinely centralized bureaucracy and a formidable military machine that combined mounted cavalry with war elephants, while land revenue arrangements like the Ikta system redistributed territory in direct exchange for military service, reshaping agrarian relationships across huge stretches of countryside. Weakened periodically by internal power struggles and by external threats such as recurring Mongol incursions, the Delhi Sultanate nonetheless paved the way for the far grander imperial project that would follow it, the Mughal Empire. Everyday life adapted to this new political order in ways both large and small. New crops, irrigation techniques, and craft traditions arrived alongside the Sultanate's rulers, while musical and culinary customs gradually blended into distinctly Indo-Islamic forms of art, cuisine, and devotional music, including the emotionally charged Qawwali tradition still performed at Sufi shrines today. The Sultanate also faced a genuinely existential threat for much of its existence in the form of repeated Mongol raids along its northwestern frontier and its ability to fend them off, even while wrestling with serious internal instability, likely spared large stretches of the subcontinent from the kind of devastation the Mongols inflicted elsewhere across Asia. In 1526, a Central Asian prince named Babur, a direct descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, won a decisive victory at the First Battle of Panipat and founded what would become the Mughal Empire. By skillfully fusing Central Asian military tactics with a sharp grasp of Indian political realities, Babur launched a dynasty destined to dominate huge stretches of South Asia for close to 2 centuries. The empire reached its true peak under Akbar, who reigned from 1556 to 1605 and remains celebrated above all for his pragmatic religious tolerance and genuine administrative brilliance. Akbar's court welcomed scholars and religious leaders from a striking range of traditions, and he even devised Din-e-Ilahi, a syncretic faith explicitly intended to bridge deep religious divides. His reforms to land revenue collection, the judicial system, and military organization strengthened central authority considerably, while still leaving substantial room for regional autonomy. The Mansabdari system, which ranked officials according to both military and civil merit, gave the empire a genuinely disciplined and effective administrative backbone. Akbar was also an unusually generous patron of the arts, actively supporting painters, architects, and craftsmen drawn from both Persian and native Indian traditions alike. His successors, Jahangir and Shah Jahan, carried that cultural momentum steadily forward. Trade with Europe deepened noticeably during their reigns as well, with English and Dutch merchants competing for access to Mughal ports and the lucrative textile trade flowing through them, a commercial relationship that would eventually tilt the balance of power in ways nobody at the imperial court could have fully anticipated. Jahangir's reign is remembered especially for its refined miniature painting and elaborate garden design, while Shah Jahan left behind the empire's single most iconic monument, the Taj Mahal, a monumental mausoleum whose fusion of Persian, Indian, and Islamic architectural elements still stands as an enduring symbol of both imperial grandeur and personal grief. That cultural and political momentum stalled hard under Aurangzeb, who ruled from 1658 to 1707. His unusually strict religious orthodoxy undid much of Akbar's earlier tolerance. He reimposed the jizya tax on non-Muslim subjects and enforced Sharia-based law with far greater rigidity than his predecessors. Decades of grinding, expensive military campaigns in the Deccan steadily drained the imperial treasury and stoked open resistance from rising regional powers, particularly the Marathas and the Sikhs. Even as the empire eventually fractured into a patchwork of competing successor states, its cultural fingerprints proved permanent. The Urdu language, forged from a blend of Persian, Arabic, and local dialects, along with Mughlai cuisine, refined court painting, and rich musical traditions, remain deeply woven into Indian identity right up to the present day. Economically, the empire became one of the wealthiest states on earth during its height, with textile production, particularly fine cotton and silk, driving enormous export trade toward Europe and the Middle East. European trading companies, eager for a share of this wealth, established modest coastal trading posts under Mughal permission during this period, small footholds that would later prove far more consequential than anyone at the time could possibly have predicted. Court culture flourished alongside this prosperity, producing exquisite miniature paintings, elaborate Urdu and Persian poetry, and formal garden design that carefully balanced geometric order against natural beauty, an aesthetic sensibility that still shapes South Asian art and architecture today. As Mughal central authority steadily crumbled, new regional forces rushed to fill the resulting power vacuum. In Western India, the Marathas, rallying under charismatic leaders like Shivaji, built a resilient and highly mobile confederacy that repeatedly challenged Mughal dominance on the battlefield. Up in Punjab, the Sikh community, galvanized by spiritual and military leaders such as Guru Gobind Singh, forged a distinctive blend of religious identity and organized resistance, capable of standing firm against outside domination. At almost the same moment, European trading powers were tightening their grip along India's coastline. The Portuguese arrived first, followed in turn by the Dutch, the French, and finally the British, all jostling aggressively for commercial supremacy in the region. Of these rivals, the British East India Company proved most adept at converting the era's political instability into genuine territorial power, steadily expanding its influence through a careful mix of shrewd diplomacy and outright military force. The decisive turning point arrived in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, where the company's forces defeated the Nawab of Bengal with crucial assistance from local defectors within his own camp. It was, by the standards of the era, a fairly modest engagement, yet its consequences proved seismic, marking the true beginning of sustained British political control in India and throwing open the door to the long colonial era that would follow. What made this moment so consequential wasn't any single decisive battle, but rather the accumulation of shifting alliances and rival ambitions, all colliding at once. Mughal provincial governors increasingly acted as independent rulers in all but name. Smaller princely states hedged their bets between competing regional and foreign powers, and European trading companies proved perfectly willing to intervene militarily in local disputes whenever doing so served their commercial interests. It was this tangled, fractured political landscape, far more than any single straightforward conquest, that ultimately handed the British East India Company the opening it needed to transform itself from a modest trading concern into the dominant power across the subcontinent. What had begun as a purely commercial venture soon became something far more powerful. In the years after Plassey, the East India Company installed compliant puppet rulers across Bengal, one of the wealthiest provinces on the subcontinent, and used that secure foothold to expand relentlessly through a calculated combination of open warfare and strategic alliance building. Conflicts like the Anglo-Mysore Wars and the Anglo-Maratha Wars steadily widened the company's territorial grip, and by the early 19th century it governed enormous stretches of India, either directly or through subordinate treaties with local rulers who retained only nominal authority. The economic toll of this expansion proved severe. Revenue arrangements such as the permanent settlement in Bengal locked in fixed tax obligations that often crushed ordinary peasant farmers while enriching an entirely new landlord class. Cultivators were increasingly pushed toward export-oriented cash crops, sometimes at real cost to local food security, while a flood of cheap British-manufactured imports gutted traditional Indian textile industries that had once been the envy of the world. To its credit, the company did leave behind some lasting infrastructure: roads, canals, and telegraph lines, though these were built primarily to move goods and troops as efficiently as possible, rather than out of any real concern for Indian welfare. Its record on education proved similarly mixed. After years of outright indifference, it eventually began funding English language and missionary schools, spreading Western ideas even as it steadily sidelined older indigenous systems of learning. Social tensions deepened further as colonial policy increasingly favored particular groups over others, sharpening long-standing divisions of both caste and religion in the process. Those accumulated grievances finally exploded in 1857, in what's now remembered as the Great Revolt, or India's first war of independence. The immediate spark was the introduction of new rifle cartridges greased with animal fat, deeply offensive to Hindu and Muslim soldiers alike, but the underlying causes ran far deeper, rooted in decades of economic exploitation and cultural disregard. Figures like the soldier Mangal Pandey and the fiercely determined Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi emerged as enduring symbols of armed resistance during the uprising. Though ultimately crushed by company forces, the revolt exposed just how fragile company rule had truly become, forcing a fundamental rethink of colonial policy back in London. Much of the company's military strength, it's worth noting, actually rested on Indian recruited soldiers known as sepoys, who made up the overwhelming majority of its fighting force, even though command remained firmly concentrated in British hands. That imbalance, vast numbers of Indian troops serving under a comparatively small British officer corps, proved critical once discontent finally boiled over in 1857, since it meant the uprising carried genuine military weight rather than remaining a purely civilian protest confined to angry crowds. In the aftermath of the 1857 uprising, the British government dissolved the East India Company entirely and placed India under direct Crown authority through the Government of India Act of 1858. This new era, remembered as the British Raj, brought sweeping, if thoroughly self-serving, modernization in its wake. An enormous rail network, sometimes described as India's steel arteries, was laid down primarily to move troops and goods efficiently, while telegraph lines, expanded postal services, and improved roadways knit the vast territory together more tightly than ever before in its history. Industrial development, however, remained deeply uneven throughout this period. Large-scale sectors like railways and mining expanded rapidly, while smaller local industries struggled to compete against a relentless flood of British-manufactured goods. The colonial administration also leaned heavily on a deliberate strategy of divide and rule, actively widening the gap between Hindu and Muslim communities, a rift made considerably worse by policies such as separate religious electorates introduced in the early 20th century. Political consciousness, though, kept growing regardless of colonial strategy. The Indian National Congress, formed in 1885 as a platform for moderate reformers seeking gradual constitutional change, while the All India Muslim League emerged in 1906, initially focused narrowly on protecting Muslim interests before eventually evolving into a movement demanding an entirely separate nation. Both organizations initially worked within the colonial system rather than against it outright, petitioning for greater representation and administrative reform before later generations of leaders pushed toward outright independence. This same era also sparked a genuine wave of social reform and cultural revival, particularly centered around Bengal. The reformer Raja Ram Mohan Roy campaigned forcefully against practices like sati, the immolation of widows, and pushed hard for expanded women's education, laying early groundwork for a broader tradition of Indian social activism. Swami Vivekananda carried Indian spiritual philosophy onto the world stage at the 1893 Parliament of Religions in Chicago, championing the universal dignity of the individual regardless of faith or origin. In Maharashtra, Jyotiba Phule and his wife Savitribai Phule worked tirelessly against entrenched caste oppression, while simultaneously promoting education for women and other marginalized communities. Meanwhile, the Bengal Renaissance produced a genuine outpouring of literature, visual art, and independent press, with towering figures like Rabindranath Tagore using culture itself as a deliberate tool of national awakening. Fierce debates over caste, gender, and religious identity ran through the whole period, as reformers and traditionalists clashed repeatedly over what a genuinely modern Indian society should actually look like. Everyday administration under the Raj also reached deep into ordinary life, standardizing courts, currency, and civil service examinations in ways that, however self-serving in their original intent, left behind institutional structures an independent India would later inherit and adapt to its own purposes. Meanwhile, a new English-educated professional class was steadily emerging in cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, and it was precisely this class of lawyers, journalists, and teachers who would go on to staff and eventually lead the nationalist movement, gathering strength just over the horizon. By the turn of the 20th century, resistance to colonial rule had shifted decisively from scattered, isolated dissent into a genuinely organized mass movement. The 1905 partition of Bengal ignited the Swadeshi movement, a determined campaign urging ordinary Indians to boycott British goods and actively rebuild indigenous industry from the ground up. The movement drew in millions of participants from across society and effectively launched the era of true mass political mobilization in India. Alongside this largely peaceful current of resistance, a far more radical strand emerged simultaneously. Revolutionaries such as Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, and Subhas Chandra Bose inspired an entire younger generation through direct, and at times openly violent, defiance of colonial authority, including bombings and targeted acts of resistance. The written and spoken word became genuine weapons in their own right during this period. Newspapers spread nationalist ideas rapidly across huge distances, while poets like Allama Iqbal and Sarojini Naidu stirred patriotic feeling that deliberately transcended religious and linguistic boundaries. Strikes, organized boycotts, and public demonstrations multiplied steadily, signaling that the independence struggle had evolved into something far broader and deeper than a political movement confined to a small circle of elites. Regional movements fed steadily into this broader national awakening as well. Trade unions organized among industrial workers, peasant associations pushed back hard against exploitative landlords, and student groups sprang up in colleges across the country, each contributing its own energy to a rapidly rising tide of anti-colonial sentiment. By the 1920s, what had once been a conversation confined largely to English-educated elites in a handful of major cities had become a genuinely mass phenomenon, reaching deep into villages and small towns that had barely registered earlier waves of organized protest. In 1915, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi returned to India from South Africa, carrying with him a philosophy that would go on to reshape not just the independence movement, but protest movements across the entire world. While in South Africa, he had developed the technique of satyagraha, literally truth force, a disciplined method of non-violent civil resistance directed against unjust laws. Back on Indian soil, he applied these same principles directly against British colonial authority, insisting throughout on the moral power of non-violence, known as ahimsa, and on the practical importance of national self-reliance, or Swadeshi. Years earlier, the non-cooperation movement had already tested these same methods on a national scale, urging Indians to withdraw from British schools, courts, and government jobs. And it was this earlier campaign that first proved satyagraha could mobilize ordinary citizens by the millions rather than remaining a small symbolic gesture. Then, in 1930, one of his most iconic acts of defiance unfolded. The now famous Dandi March, a roughly 240-mile trek to the Arabian Sea coast, undertaken specifically to produce salt in open defiance of British taxation on the substance. The march galvanized millions of ordinary Indians to join the wider civil disobedience movement, breaking unjust colonial laws peacefully and calmly accepting arrest as a deliberate form of protest. Later, during the Second World War, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement of 1942, demanding an immediate and unconditional end to British rule. Even harsh government crackdowns and mass arrests couldn't fully dampen the movement's momentum. Gandhi's vision, though, extended well beyond formal politics. He pushed hard for the upliftment of Dalits, whom he referred to as Harijans, championed rural self-sufficiency as an economic model, and worked steadily toward genuine harmony between Hindus, Muslims, and India's many other religious communities. His influence would later ripple outward to figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela, cementing his lasting reputation as a truly global symbol of peaceful resistance. Gandhi's method also proved remarkably adaptable to shifting political circumstances, evolving from small, localized protests over specific grievances into full-scale national campaigns capable of genuinely paralyzing colonial administration whenever the moment called for it. He deliberately dressed in simple homespun cotton cloth, spun thread by hand each day, and lived with striking personal austerity, turning his own daily habits into a form of political theater that ordinary Indians, regardless of literacy or wealth, could immediately understand, and, in many cases, choose to imitate themselves. Gandhi was, of course, far from the only major figure shaping this pivotal era. Subhas Chandra Bose, a fiercely committed and militant nationalist who openly rejected Gandhi's strict non-violence, formed the Indian National Army with Japanese military backing during the war, hoping to liberate India through direct armed struggle instead. Jawaharlal Nehru, one of Gandhi's closest political allies and independent India's very first Prime Minister, articulated a compelling vision of a secular, socialist, democratic nation, and would go on to guide the country through its earliest and most uncertain years of statehood. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, often remembered as the Iron Man of India, later proved absolutely essential in folding hundreds of scattered princely states into the newly formed union, holding the fledgling nation together at a moment when it easily could have splintered apart. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a brilliant jurist and lifelong reformer who fought relentlessly for the rights of marginalized communities, became the chief architect of India's new constitution, embedding principles of equality, secularism, and social justice directly into its foundation. And Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leading the Muslim League, pressed persistently for a separate Muslim homeland, a demand whose eventual success would ultimately scarve the subcontinent into two distinct nations. The long independence struggle reached its dramatic climax on August 15, 1947, when British rule finally ended and two new nations were born simultaneously, India and Pakistan. The partition plan, hastily finalized under the outgoing Viceroy Lord Mountbatten, split the provinces of Punjab and Bengal directly along religious lines. What followed was one of the largest forced migrations in all of recorded human history, with somewhere between 10 and 15 million people crossing newly drawn borders in search of the country they now considered home. The human cost proved genuinely staggering. Communal violence accompanying this mass crossing claimed well over 1 million lives, uprooted entire communities from land their families had held for generations, and left deep psychological scars that continue to shape both nations to this very day. Countless families were separated, sometimes permanently, and partition's legacy would go on to influence India's approach to secularism, refugee resettlement, and minority protection for decades afterward. Even amid this devastating violence and upheaval, India's newly formed leadership pressed determinedly forward with the task of building a genuinely democratic, pluralistic republic, living proof that lasting unity could still be forged even out of the most profound diversity and trauma. Refugee camps sprang up on both sides of the freshly drawn border almost overnight. Overwhelmed by a scale of displacement neither government had any real precedent for managing. Trains carrying migrants in both directions sometimes arrived at their destinations carrying only the dead, grim testimony to just how quickly communal trust had collapsed across communities that had coexisted for generations. Two barely functioning young governments, still finding their footing, scrambled desperately to respond to a humanitarian catastrophe of a scale the region had never confronted before. With independence finally secured, India turned its full attention to the enormous task of nation building. The new constitution, formally adopted in 1950, declared the country a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, enshrining equality before the law for a population fractured across countless languages, religions, and regional traditions. Nehru pursued an economic vision often labeled Nehruvian socialism, state-directed industrialization, ambitious scientific advancement, and a drive toward economic self-reliance, with large public sector enterprises and centralized planning steering national development. On the world stage, India charted a deliberately independent course throughout the Cold War, refusing to formally align with either the American-led or Soviet-led bloc, and instead championing decolonization and peaceful coexistence among nations. Domestically, the reorganization of Indian states along linguistic lines during the 1950s and 60s helped diffuse serious regional tensions and considerably strengthened the country's federal structure, even as poverty and widespread illiteracy remained stubbornly persistent challenges throughout this formative period. Following Nehru's death in 1964, his daughter Indira Gandhi took the reins of government and steered the country through an especially turbulent, transformative stretch of its history. The Green Revolution, powered by high-yield crop varieties and dramatically expanded irrigation, pushed India firmly towards self-sufficiency in food grain production, while her decisive leadership during the 1971 war that led to Bangladesh's independence significantly boosted the country's regional standing and influence. Yet her tenure was also marked by real controversy. The emergency, declared in 1975 and lasting until 1977, saw civil liberties suspended outright, political opposition jailed en masse, and the press placed under strict censorship, a deeply contested chapter that still sparks fierce debate today about the proper balance between democratic freedom and centralized state authority. Following Indira Gandhi's assassination in 1984, her son Rajiv Gandhi assumed leadership, pushing early economic liberalization and rapidly expanding telecommunications and computer technology across the country. But by the close of the 1980s, India found itself sliding into a genuinely serious economic crisis. That crisis ultimately forced the government's hand toward deeper reform. In 1991, under Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, India dismantled much of its restrictive industrial licensing system, sharply cut trade tariffs, and threw its doors open to foreign investment, unleashing a powerful wave of economic growth and global integration. Cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad blossomed rapidly into major international technology hubs, fueling swift urbanization and giving rise to a newly confident and increasingly consumerist Indian middle class. Politically, the national landscape kept shifting throughout this period. The Bharatiya Janata Party rose to genuine national prominence on a platform built around Hindu cultural nationalism, reshaping electoral politics and public discourse considerably in the process, while shifting regional coalitions became absolutely essential to forming any workable national government at all. Socially, India continues wrestling openly with caste-based inequality, contentious affirmative action debates, and the mounting environmental costs of rapid industrial growth, even as digital platforms have opened striking new avenues for grassroots activism, especially among the country's younger generations. India's democratic experiment, meanwhile, has defied plenty of early skeptics who doubted whether a poor, overwhelmingly rural, and staggeringly diverse country could sustain genuinely free elections at all. Yet aside from the emergency years, India has held regular, competitive elections without interruption since independence, a record matched by very few developing nations across the same stretch of decades. Modest but real proof that the pluralistic instincts running through so much of this history eventually found lasting institutional expression within the modern republic. India's story stubbornly resists any tidy narrative arc. It isn't really a tale with a clean beginning, middle, and end, but rather a continuous unfolding, forever balancing tradition against transformation and fierce local identity against sweeping national unity. From the disciplined city planning of the Indus Valley to the spiritual breakthroughs of Buddhism and Jainism, from the imperial ambition of the Mauryas and Mughals, all the way through to the hard-won triumph of independence, this is a civilization defined above all by its extraordinary ability to absorb genuine difference rather than simply erase it. That very same diversity, while unquestionably a profound source of strength, also makes India's past genuinely difficult to summarize fairly. Countless regional, religious, and linguistic threads all deserve their rightful place in the fuller picture, and no single narrative can really do justice to all of them at once. Today's India stands as something close to a civilization state, a place where ancient philosophy and thoroughly modern democratic institutions coexist side by side, drawing on centuries-old traditions of open debate, hard-won tolerance, and pluralistic coexistence, even as the country tackles distinctly modern challenges like globalization, rapid technological disruption, and mounting environmental pressure. Perhaps the deepest lesson buried within India's long history is simply this: no society ever truly stands still. Every culture is continuously reshaped by the people, ideas, and circumstances that pass through it, generation after generation. India's long journey stands as a powerful reminder of what becomes possible when a civilization repeatedly chooses synthesis over division, across thousands of years and countless upheavals. It's a journey that runs from unreadable seals stamped in Bronze Age clay to a space program launching satellites toward the Moon and Mars. And somehow, the thread connecting those two extremes never quite breaks. Since you are still here, perhaps you would like to check my other videos. The last video was about the history of Rome. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Until next time,